The tool I'm gonna show you in this video is called tRPC, and traditionally it's a purely client-side library. You're gonna see why it's so useful in a second. And yes, server-side rendering was kind of possible with it before, but nothing like the implementation I'm gonna show you in this video, because now it fully supports server architecture like React server components as they're implemented in Next.js. Let's take a look at that side by side and why that's such a big deal. Here we go. Now what you're about to see is the React component on the left-hand side and then the API route on the right-hand side, just so you're not confused. So this is the React component, just a regular client-side component at the minute, and the API route, even if the syntax is not something you're familiar with, this is nothing else than a regular API route, which anyone can make a GET request to. That's what the query is for, and the only thing it does, it just returns OK. To traditionally get the data, either with React query or this type-safe wrapper around React query called tRPC, we would do something like this. We would call this procedure from our front end, from the client-side component, using a use query, which is nothing else than a GET request that we're making to this endpoint right here. That means we can destructure the data, and because this is a type-safe wrapper around React query, we can see that the data that we get back is going to be a string because we're just returning OK, and also it might be undefined because once the page loads, this still needs to go ahead and fetch. So at the very start, when this page renders, first it's going to be undefined. And just to show you this actually works, let's display the data right here in the page, save that, and if we go right here, it should just say OK from the API route. And that's pretty standard stuff. But what happens if we want to make use and benefit from the Next.js 13 server component architecture? Just get rid of the use client, save that, and let's see if this works. And no, of course it doesn't work. Well, it says some weird stuff, but essentially it means, well, Josh, you can't do this in a server component, you dumbo. This just doesn't work. But there is actually a really cool way we can use to make this run on the server. Now, making this work server-side is incredibly easy. You can see I initialized a constant called server tRPC. It is what it says on the can. It just works on the server. We need to pass two things for the context, but these are not very important. This is just mock data and everything still works just as expected. This create caller method exists on our API endpoint, on the core wrapper around this API called the app router. And what that means, this server tRPC has access to all the same API endpoints that we can also call from the client side. So if we turn this into a server component by removing the use client because it's server by default, we can do something really cool. We can assign the data to the server tRPC, the server version of this type-safe wrapper around React query, and call the .health. We need to invoke this because it is a function, and we also need to await this operation because it is now asynchronous. Now, if you're familiar with tRPC or React query, you know there's some hooks like isLoading or arrows or whatever we can usually destructure from this. On the server, of course, this does not work. We do not have access to hooks. How would we display a loading state on the server? This data is just fetched, put into our page right here, all on the server. We can get rid of the client-side import right here by pressing Shift, Alt, and O. That gets rid of all the unused imports. And now if we go back to our page, we are gonna get the same message, but it's all fetched on the server and not on the client. Let's verify that. Let's go into the network tab and take a look at all the fetch requests that are done. We're gonna see none on the client because this is purely done on the server. And the best part, I haven't even told you yet, this works so smoothly with the Next.js server actions. Let's add another API endpoint. To do that, we're gonna first import z from Zod so we can validate the input. We get the post request body we get on the server side because this right side is the server side. We're gonna create an endpoint that anyone, no matter if they're authenticated or not, can make a request to a public procedure. And in this procedure, we expect the post request body to be an object with a name property that is of type string. This is how we can enforce that by using a schema validation library. If the input is not passed in that way, the API will throw an error. And as for the actual business logic, this happens inside of a mutation, which is nothing else than the API route logic that we're handling, and we're only logging the input, which is this name property right here, which we get access to by destructuring it in the mutation mutation, we can just log it out to the console. Normally, of course, this would be your database call to actually add something to the database. Let's save this and perform a server-side mutation. You're gonna see why that is so cool. We do that in Next.js by creating a form element with a certain action. And this action represents nothing else than a regular function. Let's call it add post. And this needs to be an asynchronous function for server actions in Next.js to work. We can simply use the use server, and this is nothing else than an RPC. It's a remote procedure call. It abstracts the actual API route logic away from us so we can just use it as if it was a regular function. Let's add that add post as an action to our form, and that's gonna pass all the data automatically. Let's say form data. This is of type form data, something we don't need to import. This is a regular type, and it's automatically gonna be passed from the form once we submit it. In here, we want an input where we can enter the name of our post that we want to create in the database. And the important thing here is giving this a name, because this is how we access it later in the form data. Let's call it post name, for example. And then also we need a button that is of type submit to submit this form when clicking it. Let's just say add inside of this button. Let's see what currently happens. Let's log out the form data and go to our local host, input something. We can get rid of the network tab. I'm gonna click add, and we should be able to see this in the server-side console because this is a server-side form. All right, let's take a look, and we can see the name, post name, and the value we just entered. Perfect. That means we can now actually call our API endpoint from the server. How cool is that? We do this by first retrieving this post value or post name right here, this value. We can do that very easily by just saying const post name is going to be equal to, and then the form data, we can call something on that because it's a record. We can say dot get, and from here we can get whatever we call it. This would be this name we gave it in the form as the post name, and let's cast it as a string type because normally it is a different type. And the only thing we need to do now is call our server-side tRPC. Remember that we created right here with some mock data that just works out of the box. We can do that by saying await server tRPC dot, and this again has access to all our API endpoints. That is really, really cool. We can call the add post, and then here we automatically know what the input should be because we defined it right here on the right hand side. Let me make this a bit larger. We know the input needs to have a name property of type string, and because this is type safe, we can enforce it from this function too. The name is gonna be the post name, and just like that, we should see a console log add post with whatever data we typed in into the input once we perform this action. Let's go ahead, say hello world. That's what our post should be named. Let's click add, and now we should see it in the console show up right here. Add post hello world. Perfect. Of course, this would be your regular database call, not just logging it out. But the fact that this works server-side is really impressive. Hey, I really hope you enjoyed this video. This is genuinely a really cool change for me. I'm not just saying that to hype up the video. I mean, it's almost over anyways. I genuinely think this is really cool. Just the fact that we can use the same things from the client and the server without many changes. Wow. I hope you enjoyed this change as much as I do, learn something new, and then I'm gonna see you in the next video. Have a good one, and bye-bye.